Secretary General of the Reform Country of Singapore. Mr. Jeyaretnam, you have 5 minutes, but since you come from Singapore, which is next to Malaysia, maybe you can give a bit more leeway, but not too much, okay? Thank you very much. I'd like to invite Mr. Muhammad Daud Tolo, Chief of the Secretariat of the People's Islamic Unity Party of Afghanistan, to come to the podium. Thank you.
Dear delegates, I would like to thank ICAPP once again and the AK Party of Turkey for inviting us to this conference. We meet this week in Istanbul in the midst of a humanitarian crisis, right on the doorstep of our host. One of the worst civil wars in modern history has forced nearly 5 million Syrians into exile, of whom 3 million are living in camps within Turkey. A platform to share perspectives therefore provides a timely and much-needed opportunity to develop collective initiatives. Whilst Reform Party is still a small opposition party in Singapore and therefore denied a voice by the authoritarian and repressive government, I will do my best to shed some light on the unique Singaporean approach to migration and refugees by sharing our government's historical approach, which I hasten to add, the Reform Party does not condone. The refugee crisis in our region is a humanitarian one, requiring a humanitarian approach. It is estimated that upwards of 100,000 Rohingya refugees have fled Myanmar. AIDS workers tell us that amongst refugees, nearly all female refugees, including the children, arrive having been raped, and it is well documented that survivors of torture from the war in Sri Lanka have been raped and sexually assaulted, including a majority of the men. The lifetime physical scars are very real, whilst the mental scars are no less debilitating, making eventual rehabilitation of a refugee or survivor into a new and often strange culture a sensitive and difficult procedure. But before resettlement can happen, refugees have to first reach dry land, and the journey as a refugee is never straightforward. Our government's Ministry of Home Affairs has made Singapore's position very clear when it said recently, as a small country with limited land, Singapore is not in a position to accept any person seeking political asylum or refugee status, regardless of their ethnicity or place of origin. I believe this reaction to the refugee crisis in our region is morally indefensible, as we are simply sidestepping our humanitarian obligation. Singapore's stated reason for not accepting refugees is lack of land, but does this excuse the cold water? Any Singaporean of my generation is aware of the Vietnamese boat people crisis of the 70s and 80s. At that time, and only after extreme pressure was applied, the Prime Minister Kuan reluctantly agreed to take about 1,000 refugees for 90 days, with multiple conditions attached for processing, as he put it. Mr. Lee later complained about what he called broken promises by resettlement countries and described the experience as bitter. As a result, Singapore announced at the closing of a refugee camp that refugees would no longer be allowed into the country, even temporarily, even if a third country had pledged to take them in. You've got to grow calluses on your heart, he said, or you just bleed to death. Our foreign minister added, we don't want to create a Palestinian situation. We cannot afford a population of embittered, inchoate refugees. I apologize to our Palestinian colleagues for any offence this causes. It would seem that an historic personal grudge or playback is also behind our refusal to tackle the current boat people crisis. As for land, no one can deny Singapore is small and crowded. At the time that statement was made, Singapore had a population of 2 million. It was small then, but interestingly, Singapore is larger today. In fact, our land area has grown by 23%. Meanwhile, a population of 2 million has expanded to 5,600,000 through a deliberate government policy of immigration, sustained by continued investment in infrastructure. Further Furthermore, our government's own population white paper of 2013 set out how Singapore must prepare for a population of 6.9 million through migration, as our own fertility levels are below replacement levels. Therefore, the excuses given about lack of land or overcrowding of population do not ring true. It's just an excuse by a government trying to evade its humanitarian obligation. In fact, whenever our citizens complain about the number of new immigrants, the PAP reminds us that economic growth is dependent on an expanding population. Elsewhere, the PAP government have an open-door policy for companies wishing to bring in cheap labour from neighbouring countries. All told, more than 1.6 million foreign workers live and work on our island at this moment, and half our population is made up of migrants. What about scarcity of resources or finances? We apparently have huge financial reserves. I say apparently because we Singaporeans are not allowed to know how much taxpayer money is actually accrued. But I can hazard it as a qualified guess as an economist. In 2012, Singapore was one of the first countries that agreed to pledge $4 billion to the IMF as a buffer against European economic woes. This was done without parliamentary scrutiny. So great are our reserves, it seems this sum is not even worth mentioning. Singapore has no minimum wage legislation, no welfare state, and very few labour protections or employee rights. In this respect also, we are ideally placed to take in refugees. In Singapore, no one could accuse refugees of overburdening the benefit system because we don't have one. I believe real reason for the Singapore government's refusal to accept refugees has to do with the PAP's socially engineered society and a calibrated racial and religious balance that keeps the PAP in power. In addition, like any authoritarian regime, Singapore keeps its people in check by keeping them in fear of the enemy at the gate. The PAP narrative is of a tiny Singapore surrounded by much larger, hostile Muslim neighbours. Singapore is therefore particularly reluctant to let in any refugees from Muslim countries that would show the state narrative to be a fairy tale. It is the Reform Party's view that we can afford to take in a limited number of refugees without imperiling Singapore's social fabric or economic status. At one end of the scale, Chancellor Merkel, with similar labour needs, has agreed to take in up to 1 million Syrian refugees and offer them permanent resettlement. Singapore can certainly afford to take in a few hundred. If we won't or can't accept any asylum seekers, we are clearly in a position to offer financial support to countries that do with much larger sums than the few $100,000 currently being pledged. At the same time, a word of warning. While saving lives is a priority, we must also examine the reverse side of accepting refugees. In insurance analysis, there's the concept of moral hazard. In moral hazard, the person insured actually becomes indifferent to risks or takes greater risk because he knows he is well insured. If we willingly accept refugees from regimes that pursue repressive or genocidal policies towards their minorities, we may be encouraging those regimes to become more extreme. Providing aid, we are simply providing an insurance policy that picks up the pieces of the people those governments have broken. For example, does Myanmar refuse to accept that the Rohingyas are citizens with legitimate rights with impunity because they are confident that they can shove the victims into someone else's backyard? So whilst I do not accept excuses about lack of resources or upsetting racial harmony, I do not recommend an open-door policy. We must ensure that humanitarian issues of refugees go hand in hand with harsh sanctions against pariah nations that caused the problems in the first place. To conclude, Singapore is a wealthy nation. It is blessed with a strategic and uniquely safe geographical location. We have high-tech medical equipment and world-class emergency and medical professionals. Our own government plans to stretch our population to 7 million or more over the next decade. Already, half of our population is composed of migrants. Our population comprises a good mix of race, religions, and creeds. Imported labour is vital to our economy. There are no benefit systems to burden. Furthermore, Lee Kuan Yew is now dead. It is time to move on, time to shrug off his vendettas and grudges, his racial bigotry, and his inhumane eugenic policies. I say we should embrace this opportunity to take our place on the global stage in a new spirit of compassion. We don't need calluses on our hearts. We certainly are not going to bleed to death or even bleed at all. We must address this crisis, we must address it together, and we must address it now. Singapore has quite simply run out of excuses. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jeyaretnam. We took more time, but it was a good speech. The time now is 6:13, and we have 2 more speakers. So I think if the 2 speakers after this follow the time, maybe we can allow the member from the Philippines